Bonsoir, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 2021 Night of Ideas, La Nuit des Idées 2021. I am Dr. Jean-Eric Ghia, Associate Professor at the Department of Immunology and Internal Medicine at the University of Manitoba, and I'm also the Honorary Consul of France here in Winnipeg. Welcome to all of you here at the Alliance Française du Manitoba, which is the main organizer of this year's virtual event. Before we start, I would like to begin by acknowledging that the Alliance Française is located on the original land of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene people, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. So we respect the treaties that were made on this territory. We acknowledge the harms and the mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. So this is the 6th edition of the Night of Idea around the theme Close, Closer. So during this pandemic, we all feel vulnerable, and we question ourselves on our health and on our place in the society, and also on our relation with others, and more specifically with the nature. I assume some of you felt close to their family and friend and discover this by not seeing them as often, or I would say at all. So some other maybe they rediscover a sense of proximity with nature by baking some bread. We saw a lot of that on the social media, gardening and walking, or maybe walking in the forest. So tonight, during this roundtable, we will touch this notion of proximity with nature in the context of medicine. So with our special guests, we will discuss the differences in cultural approaches, and more specifically between indigenous and westernized medicine, and as well as the potential of blending of these two strategies into new health policy. So on one side of my screen, I'm looking on my screen here at the bottom. Yeah, I have Dr. Marcia Anderson. She's a Cree Anishinaabe with roots in the Norway House, Cree Nation and Pegi First Nation in Manitoba. Dr. Anderson holds the position of Vice Dean Indigenous Health, and she is the Executive Director of Indigenous Academy Affairs in the Ongomizi Indigenous Institute of Health and Healing at Radi Faculty of Health Science at the University of Manitoba. She practiced internal medicine and public health as a medical officer of health with the Winnipeg Regional Health Authority. She was recognized for her contribution to Indigenous people's health with the National Aboriginal Achievement Award in March 2011. Welcome, Dr. Anderson. On the other side of my screen, is Nurse Mélanie MacKinnon, a member of the Mississippi Cree Nation with roots in the Pimishikmak Cree Nation and Wawudent with an influence Manitoba. She is a senior health leader and advocate with an influential indigenous voice with the province and the country. Since 2011, Ms. MacKinnon is the Executive Director of Indigenous Health Service in the Ongomizi Indigenous Institute of Health and Healing. She worked in the private sector as a health consultant in program planning, health science system design, advisory and negotiation service to assist First Nation and Indigenous government organization. Welcome, Ms. MacKinnon, and thank you for both of you to be here tonight with this night of idea. So when we hear cultural medicine approach, the first things that comes to my mind is that both indigenous people from Western origin actually face the development of the same disease. I would say maybe in a different proportion. However, most of the time when we all go to the hospital, the treatment that we are receiving focus on Western medical approach based, I would say, on scientific research done over the last 50 years. But having said that, indigenous community use other strategy based, I would say, on cultural healing. So my first question to two of you would be how we can define this concept of cultural healing.
Well, thank you for that. And maybe I can start. You know, when I think about this question, as a Korean Anishinaabe woman who's also been trained in Western medicine, I suppose I think about health and healing that's grounded in Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous knowledge systems, and then my medical practice, which is grounded in Western knowledge systems. And actually, that both have their forms of science, of knowledge creation and reproduction and transmission, but that they're specific to those different knowledge systems. And one of the interesting things about that question to me, I think, is we don't talk about healing a lot in Western medicine. And I think that's a really important or critical difference. We talk a lot about treatment. We talk some about health. More recently, we talk a bit about well-being or wellness, but rarely do we talk about healing. And so one of the things I would reflect on that in terms of Indigenous knowledge systems around health and healing is around the grounding in relationships, and in restoring those relationships as a critical part of healing, and the encompassing of mind, body, spirit, and emotions. Whereas again, in Western medicine, we certainly focus a lot more on the physical aspects of medicine and of health, and somewhat on mental health. Certainly, probably not as much as needs to be, and that's often been discussed. But then again, the teachings that I have heard from different knowledge keepers around those relationships is not even just around myself or my relationships with other people, but again, around relationships to the earth and to everything else that is on the earth. And I think that's probably the strongest link in what you were talking about in terms of the relationship between Indigenous health and healing and proximity to nature.
So do you think that so it's an overall concept, and in this concept that you have, it's more like you have different approach with, I would say, a spiritual approach, an emotional approach, a physical approach, and maybe a mental or an intellectual approach. So in that concept, the idea is to take everything together and to approach the disease by taking as a global person the patient. Maybe Ms. MacKinnon?
Sure, I can. Thank you for that question. So even the word disease, right? It's dis-ease. It is, not balanced, not well, perhaps not aligned. And just to add on to what Dr. Anderson had shared, part of our teachings are also about our identity and our purpose, our accountability, our responsibilities. And so it is very much a bilateral, trilateral relationship with other individuals and people in this world, but also with, our animal and plant brothers and sisters. And so, our Dakota brothers and sisters talk about, a concept of mitakuyasin, which is all my relations and our responsibility to them and amongst one another, because we are very much dependent, or the interdependence is what is where our survival lies, right? So it is very much that broader concept of spiritual, physical, mental, social, and culture is again a humanistic construct, as opposed to what we would think of more in regards to our ways of being. And so that is the daily practice that we are all responsible to understand those teachings and our responsibilities as we move through each phase and stage of life, and trying to understand what our responsibilities are.
So I just would like to go back to what Professor Anderson mentioned, is that the approach that we are having on the Western side is like it looks like it's more like a Cartesian approach, meaning we try to put in different boxes, different disease, and we know how we say like the physiological disconnection between the different organ, and it's really like, yes, like you smoke, you have a greater chance to have and to develop lung cancer or something like that. Here, it's more like the way that indigenous are approaching the thing is taking the globality, right?
Yes, and I do think that is something that is often a teaching of the medicine wheel, which is maybe one of the concepts of health and healing that people might be familiar with, which, as Mel was talking about, does describe having balance in those different aspects of self. And while there's those teachings of mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual in that, there's also the 4 directions teachings in that. There's life cycle teachings in that, which again talks a lot about your roles and responsibilities at each phase in life, but also how that role and responsibility relates to where other people are in their phases of life. And so in contrast to a Cartesian or linear reduction way of thinking, which is kind of A plus B equals C, the medicine wheel teaches us to think a lot more in every direction around us and to see those complex relationships around us and to look for a balance, and really to honor and respect those different relationships in every direction. So I think those are some fundamental differences.
So do you think in that case that the time that a practitioner is spending with a patient, because we are in the society, everything is going really fast. In that case, do you think it may be more efficient to spend a little bit more time with the patient, to take the patient as a in its global shape, in terms of globality?
I do think so, but I think that you need to look at how that can be reciprocal as well, because just like as a physician or in other health professional, people are trained to be objective and to enter into that relationship as a provider with expertise. That's not necessarily going to work in the context for Indigenous peoples, right? If you want to have this broader approach. And so, for example, when I see Indigenous people in my clinic, very commonly we'll do this little exchange where we talk about where each other's families are from. And that's a way of establishing our relationship. Mm-hmm. They might ask me about certain experiences that I've had. And again, it's around finding that common ground. Whereas it would be very unusual for one of my non-Indigenous patients to try to establish some type of kinship connection in that way. So even though there are some elements, for example, in primary care practice, where this more sometimes called holistic approach is encouraged, it's still not necessarily in that reciprocal, we're in a relationship as humans. It still tends to be more in a, I'm the provider, you're the patient type of way, which is different. And so I think also part of incorporating more Indigenous approaches, at least for me as a First Nation physician, is to actually relate even to the patients that I see, first as a First Nation person and then as a physician who is a First Nations person.
Okay, so do you think like in term, like maybe we can switch and move maybe a little bit on the research side? So that's for the practitioner. We know that that there is some scientific evidence that this holistic approach works. And especially in the context of the North community and the Indigenous community. Do you have some example in mind where you maybe the researcher or like blended the 2 different techniques and show that the outcome was actually better by blending the 2 techniques when they were providing that to the Indigenous community?
So, a few of the things I would mention before diving into, I'll use one study as an example. I think I really appreciate where you're coming from with this question, and how I want to frame that for the listeners though also is we're not talking about using Western methods, Western research methods or science to validate Indigenous knowledges of health and healing, because Indigenous knowledges of health and healing have been validated over time. And when we think about the fact that our ancestors have lived on this land for thousands of years, birthing babies, healing broken bones, treating illnesses, there is a whole health and healing system that is valid in and of itself. And so the question is not, is it valid, but what happens when it's combined with Western medicine, as Indigenous people have the right, to access both Indigenous methods of health and healing as well as Western medicines. And I would say there are few studies, but there are some that look at this. But I want to come back to a point that Mel mentioned earlier, which was around the importance of cultural identity to Indigenous people's health. And so one of the most common studies that's discussed is a study that was done by Chandler and Lalonde, which looked at the rates of youth suicide in First Nations communities in BC by markers of what they call cultural continuity. And what they found was there was actually an almost linear relationship between markers of cultural continuity and youth suicide, such that the more markers of this cultural continuity a community had, the fewer youth suicides were present. And similarly, the fewer markers of cultural continuity they had, the more youth suicides were present. And so this was one study that showed the protective effects of cultural continuity and strong cultural identity.
So that's really important, and I think by rephrasing the question, you raise an interesting point. Is that yes, for years, it was here, and why in the society those type of strategy in the big city disappear? Maybe you can elaborate on the historical approach of that.
Maybe I can start, Marcia. You can you can add anything that I may have forgot. So we were talking really about centuries of cultural genocide, right? Starting with legislation, certainly the relocation, the stolen lands. Coming into about a century ago, the introduction of a Western healthcare system in several First Nation communities that were operated by, primarily, if not only, the federal government, and the abolishment of ceremonies was much sooner than the actual introduction of a healthcare kind of program. I wouldn't call it a system, and today I still wouldn't call it a system, not in relation to what it should look like. So, this concept of my knowledge is better than your knowledge, or quite frankly, to Indigenous people, you don't have knowledge, has been the system that has grounded our healthcare services for the past 100 years. And it's only been, I would argue, just within the last decade that we're starting to have these conversations about what our knowledge is, what our system is, and what it could or should look like, certainly from an integrated perspective, because there is merit in Western medicine, as we all know. And for those of us that get to live and practice and blend and combine, our ancestral knowledge or Indigenous knowledge with what we've learned from Western medicine, it is, and it's not just for us. I think the world is also benefiting from this knowledge, and we're seeing that kind of social resurgence, if you will, where all of us are trying to find a better way to live a more balanced life, whether that's through, other wellness practices like meditation or yoga, or, different regimes. But what we're really, really talking about is or deconstructing a construct that we never designed and we never wanted, and unfortunately was placed on us. Anything else to add, Marcia?
The only thing I will add, just to make it really explicit, was that those forces of assimilation or cultural genocide that Melanie described, traditional healing disappeared maybe to the everyday or the Canadian view, but was actually always present. Like we had healers and knowledge keepers who took that and hid it appropriately to keep it safe, so that at a time when it was safer, it could be more out in the open again, it could be transmitted again. And certainly, you know, since I've been in medical school, I've been really honored to be able to see some of this wider spread reclamation, not even just in First Nation communities on reserves, but in urban landscapes and areas as well.
So do you think that that also with how the society and where the society, when I say society, the world is going, do you think that there is a risk of losing all this knowledge, you know, like where you have young person, you know, moving from the different community to big city, and we have on the other side the elder who are passing and not be able finally to transfer this knowledge. Do you think there is a risk, or now there is more like a sense of we have to keep it, and this is the job of the young generation who has to actually take and to lift it up?
I do think there are still risks that we need to be aware of, and that we need to be really strategic and diligent in how we protect from those risks. One that we will often hear older people talk about is how much of the knowledge is embedded in the language. And so language revitalization is a really critical part of protecting knowledge around Indigenous health and healing as well. Land-based, as we've talked about, a lot of these ceremonies and practices are land-based. They require medicines that are harvested from the forests, from the waters, etc. So if we are not taking action on climate change and protecting the land, that also will be a risk to some of these health and healing practices. And having green space, for example, in urban areas or open space where people who are urban dwelling who maybe don't have the means to get out to ceremonial grounds where that can be set up in a more accessible way would also be an important part. So there are risks, but there are also strategies that we can be using to mitigate those risks.
So, so talking about the strategy, do you think that like what the federal government developed, you know, like specific strategic plan, like patient-oriented research, do you think that now the federal government or the provincial government are more keen to go to something related to Indigenous people and to develop different strategic plan, more like focus on that approach?
So again, I think this is something where we can look at what's needed separate, but what also is important within, for example, the strategy on patient-oriented research. So one of the criticisms of Indigenous health research is an incredibly high proportion of it is descriptive research, and that is very important, but a very small percent is clinical interventional research. And I think, as Mel had talked about, we can deconstruct and analyze why that is and talk about what components of Indigenous knowledges of health and healing could be brought into the patient-oriented research strategy with leadership from diverse Indigenous peoples to make it a more culturally safe space, to make patient-oriented research more relevant and then more beneficial to Indigenous peoples. And at the same time, we can look at under rubrics of reconciliation, of reparations, around cultural preservation, what additional strategies are needed and investments are needed to support, again, Indigenous leadership over protecting Indigenous knowledges of health and healing.
So it means that I read a couple of times that the CHR, Canadian Health Research Institute, like developed a new institute. Do you have any Are you part of this institute, and do you know what the institute is now trying to provide in terms of the different aspects that they will support?
Yeah, I actually am on the advisory board for the Institute of Indigenous Peoples Health, which is the research pillar in CIHR that's focused on Indigenous people's health. Previously was named Institute for Aboriginal People's Health, so it's been around for quite some time now. A major part of what they've focused on has been research mentorship, and then also on setting the standard for engagement with Indigenous peoples in research, and how institutions like universities, for example, need to change in order to carry out research with Indigenous peoples in rights-based ways. And so, for example, a major shift that was successful through the leadership of IIPH was changing the rules so that research funding could flow through universities to Indigenous communities themselves for carrying out Indigenous health research. And that type of process is really important when we want to talk about Indigenous knowledges of any kind, but including of health and healing, because we need to ensure that the ownership of that knowledge stays with Indigenous communities, not with academic researchers or academic institutions.
And I think that's really important. And is that something, with your experience, is that something that you see on a daily basis, like, you know, where finally at the end the outcome of the research doesn't really stay with the community, and you have something which is completely diverted? Do you see that on a regular basis, or it's something that it's not as so common?
Well, I think we have long and challenging histories of research on Indigenous peoples. And so 60, 70 years ago, we had those nutritional experiments going on in residential schools in some First Nations communities right in Manitoba, which certainly had academic benefit or health system leader benefit for those people who were carrying them out and leading them, but were not only not beneficial to First Nations people, but were actually harmful. And those weren't unique. So there's a lot of experiences where research has actually been harmful to Indigenous people in the past, at the same time that the researchers were accruing benefit from those research studies. So we are in the midst of a shift still away from that to where there is benefits to Indigenous communities and peoples themselves. Now part of the standard for research ethics approval when it comes to Indigenous health research is to demonstrate what that benefit to Indigenous communities will be. And I think that's a really important shift.
So maybe to finish, one of the key questions is, how do you see the future? Maybe we're going to start with Ms. MacKinnon. How do you see the future? Do we have a bright future in front of us, or it's still gray or dark black?
Well, that's a big question. I think maybe just before I answer that, just to, add on to what Dr. Anderson shared about research, it's whose validation are we looking for? And I think that's what our ceremonial leaders and our healers tell us. They don't need to be validated, by a non-Indigenous source. They know their medicine works. And so that's always been the challenge. And there's also the fear of not just reprisal, but also this concept of trying to legislate our medicines. Like, my background is more of the policy and legislative kind of programming aspect of healthcare. And so I don't know how you, from a scientific perspective, how you measure the healing from walking on the ground for 4 days barefoot, or sun dancing for 4 days and fasting, right? And I don't know from my Sundance chief if that would ever be allowed. People are certainly welcome from non-Indigenous people to participate in several circles and ceremonies, but not for validation. So I think that conversation is very, very early as to what that looks like in relation to to a blended or an integrated model of care, and it will definitely have to be led by, you know, those healers and those Indigenous leaders. But of course, I would say the future is bright. And I mean, from an anecdotal perspective, the healing that I've witnessed myself and that privilege to bear witness to individual and collective healing is a blessing. And so as we see more youth and more of our own brothers and sisters and aunties and uncles come back into our ceremonies and come back into our circles, there is a resurgence, and it is you know, what we're really talking about is a life force and a healthy life. And so and that's also what's going to get us through COVID.
Definitely. So just like you mentioned COVID now, I'm sorry, just Dr. Anderson, just mentioned COVID. What about the strategy that has been established to fight COVID in the remote community? Do you think like it's going in a good way, or it's just like again, it's like taking into consideration what the community really wants and how we want to approach them? How do you think, are we going in the right direction?
So Mel and I kind of eat, sleep, and breathe COVID most of our waking hours and sometimes of our sleeping hours as well. And one thing I would say around that is we were positioned to experience this pandemic in conditions not of our choosing, right? Nobody chose to live in a situation with such significant overcrowded, inadequate housing, or being concentrated in lower income groups, or having inequitable access to education or food security. That was not of our choosing. Those are byproducts of a long history of colonization. And if we could have chosen, would have chosen an equal right to the highest attainable standard of health before the pandemic started, so that we wouldn't be seeing the disproportionate impacts that we are seeing now. So now the situation that we're in is trying to mitigate or minimize the majorly disproportionate impacts of COVID on First Nation communities because of that inequitable access to underlying determinants of health. And so there's really actual limited choice available to First Nations communities in how that is done now because of the starting point. That being said, we do try to work very closely with communities to, provide the support that we can to the response. It's largely public health driven, but recognizing the importance of community infrastructure as well. But I think, the reality is it's limited choice in the response. What the major positive from my perspective has been asserting First Nations leadership over the First Nations response and bringing some more accountability and improving really some of the system level responses in this difficult situation that we've inherited.
Okay, so it's a good way where to go. So you think so for the future, like the future is still bright?
Yes, it's getting brighter is what I would say. I think we do have a lot more First Nations health professionals now with a lot of experience. We have some very supportive allies. We've been working hard on systems change and recognizing the rights of Indigenous people. And as we've already talked about, we've seen significant revitalization of language and culture and Indigenous knowledges. And I think all of those factors are making the future brighter.
So I think that's on the note that we are going to close the discussion, a note of hope that we will close the discussion. So I wish this discussion had really provided you, the audience, with an opportunity really to better understand the notion or the different notion around the cultural approach that we all have as a different background around the medicine, and that I think we can together think of a promising future in maybe blending, maybe adding, depending from where you are seeing the story, the two different approach, and really working with community really to incorporate all these different cultural strategy. And I think with really the dialogue, a dialogue with open, I think, researcher and medicine practitioner, I think over time maybe more willing now, or are now more willing to explore other avenue in incorporate some of these different strategy used by indigenous community. And as you mentioned a couple of times, this is strategy that over time we don't have proof it works, as you mentioned, you know. So it's really, I think it's really important. Any last word for the two of you, just to before we close the discussion?
I just wanted to say, oh,
Go ahead, Marcia.
I was just going to say thank you for giving us a bit of a break from COVID, and it was a pleasure to join you and talk about these things.
Ms.
Yes,
MacKinnon?
it was very good for our intellectual and mental health on the medicine wheel.
Yeah.
Okay, so before we finish, I would like to thank the local people behind the organization of the roundtable: Emmanuel Perez, director of the Alliance Française, Professor Catherine Cook, who is the Vice President, Indigenous at University of Manitoba, John Kersey, who is the Vice President External, and our two special guests tonight, Professor Anderson and Nurse MacKinnon. And I also would like to present a special thanks to our local partner here in Manitoba, the University of Manitoba, the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, the Centre Culturel Franco-Manitobain, CBC Radio-Canada, but also at large, the French government via the French Embassy in Canada and the Ambassador Karen Rispal and l'Institut Français. Miigwech, merci, thank you, have a good night, bonne fin de nuit à tous. Bye.